And today we're going to have a brilliant session around building trust for intra-Africa investment. And I look at the theme. First of all, we all know it's a fireplace chat we're having, right? But I'm looking for the fire, and I can't find it. So I'm asking myself, where is the fire? I believe the fire is going to come from the brilliant ideas we're going to discuss here. They're going to be sharp enough to burn up this room. But building trust for intra-Africa investments reminds me of a question that I'm sure many of you have heard about, which is the egg and the chicken, which one comes first? The theme here is not saying we need to build trust before we can have investment. Investment might be the basis in which we can actually build trust. And a number of things that are going to help us put this concept into perspective is that Africa is at a crossroad of economic and demographic revolution. So when you think of the figure, which I'm sure you've heard about many times, that 60% of the continent's population is below 25 years. That represents a promise, but at the same time, it represents a paradox. It is a promise if we tap into it because it will make the continent the greatest competitive advantage, the youth bulge. It can be a paradox if that population is left uneducated, unemployed, and underrepresented. We know the potential it has for societal fragility. But let's look at other figures that are really going to help us put the discussion here today into perspective further. The UNDP prepared a report in 2023 that says by 2050, Africa will be home to 1/3 of the world's youth. At the same time, the Africa Development Bank says every year in Africa, about 12 million youth join the workforce, but the continent is only creating 3 million jobs. That's only 25% of the new workforce if we assume all of the jobs that are created are actually for youth, only 25%. Youth unemployment rates in countries such as South Africa, Nigeria, Tunisia exceed 30%. One last statistic that I believe is important for our discussion today. According to the United Nations, 80% of violent extremist recruits in Africa cite the issues of unemployment and lack of opportunity as primary reasons for joining extremism. These figures point to the importance of how can we build trust for a population that is so central in maintaining peace and security, or not being vulnerable and falling in the arms of extremism, but also how can investment make this happen? So we will explore how we can take responsible actions towards increasing the investment to trade, for us to trade more, build trust, especially in a world where geopolitical uncertainties are high. So to delve into this discussion, I have two distinguished panelists who are going to join me on the stage. And one thing I like about the panelists is that I will say there are different sides but of the same coin. We have academics who has written extensively on the topic, and we have a practitioner who, of course, before you become a practitioner, you must have been an academic as well. You just didn't become a practitioner. So joining me for this discussion, we have Professor Atif Main, who brings powerful blend of academic rigor and real-world insights to today's global economic conversation. Prof, are you in the room? Okay, I wanted to be sure. Now, the picture I have here is what I'm seeing. We are really glad that he's not only here, but he's a professor of economics on public policy and finance at the Princeton University, where he also directs the Center for Public Policy and Finance. I know I can go on very long, but it's important to share some of his biography. He has roots in mathematics and science, and he earned his PhD from MIT and started his academic career way back in 2001, long time ago, but he's very young. Before joining Princeton in 2012, he taught at the University of California in Berkeley and the University of Chicago, both schools of business, shaping minds at some of the world's most respected institutions. Prof has undertaken research in finance, macroeconomics, and society, and asks profound questions about how economic systems can connect people, distribute opportunity, and create value. He is also a passionate advocate for knowledge that drives impact, as he co-founded the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan back in 2007. He is widely recognized for co-authoring the influential book, House of Debt, which is a landmark study on the household debt and financial services. We are lucky to have him here today as Professor Atif's work, which focuses on macroeconomic implications of inequality, sheds light on its effects on financial markets, growth, and policy. So he will bring us the perspective from academic, but also practice, given the policy centers he has established, as well as also continues to work in. Please join me to give a round of applause in welcoming Professor Atif to the floor. Most welcome. And to join the conversation, as we believe in practical examples and experience, we will have the CEO of the Rwanda Development Board, Jean-Guy Africa, who leads an institution with a broad mandate spanning investment promotion, private sector development, tourism, conservation, technology, and management of special economic zones. The Rwanda Development Board's unique one-stop center is a model that streamlines business registration, incentives, and regulatory processes, making Rwanda one of Africa's most competitive investment destinations. Before joining RDB, Jean-Guy has also worked and held leadership positions with the Africa Development Bank, including acting director of the Regional Integration Coordination Office, and also led the regional integration. And one thing that is also outstanding about his background and his profile, in those positions, he has worked on resource allocation, reporting around $14 billion project portfolio. Huge. I'm sure a big chunk of some of the economies of our country's budget. So we are happy to have him here today to share his experience, and you cannot be having a last name Africa without having a reflection on Africa as a whole. So please help me, join me in welcoming Jean-Guy Africa, who is joining the podium as well. Jean-Guy, we know that investment is critical, but especially in certain areas when we talk about security across the region. So I want you to share with us some practical solutions and successful models to build trust. Examples include mutual investment guarantees, cross-border infrastructure projects, digital mechanisms, and many. How can these be leveraged to promote trust and strengthen peace and security on the continent?
Thank you very much. Also, a pleasure to be here. I think I'll touch on the question you asked from the angle of how can regional arrangements and regional investments in general help promote trust and security. And here, you have three key dimensions that are at play that you must simultaneously address if you're trying to generate trust through regional investments. The first one is the politics of it. The second one is the economics, and the third one is the actual security dimension. So you have to tackle the three almost simultaneously. Regional arrangements, the ones you've mentioned, the efforts that we're making through our regional economic communities, the initiatives that we push, what they do is provide a platform to discuss and harmonize policies across a series of sectors: transport, agriculture, trade, investment. And in so doing, the dialogue that takes place, the meetings, and there are a lot of them when you meet at regional level, naturally over time generate trust among policymakers as they push for certain legal instruments to be adopted, work together to implement those instruments. So at the first level, at the policy dimension, the regional projects, regional arrangements help promote trust through dialogue, through policy formation, and through policy execution. Where it gets really interesting is in the economics front. Through the creation of economic interdependencies, especially when you're dealing with the financing, the structuring, financing, and implementation of large-scale assets. Think, for example, railways, energy grids, and so on. And it's actually a classic case study for students of regional integration, which I happen to be. And that one is actually the formation of the European Union. People forget, but the actual creation of the European Union was, the basis was a security matter. 1951, France and Germany keep going at war, huge security problem, and the question at the time was, how do we come up with a solution, an economic one, to make sure that the countries of the time that were engaged in that problem, primarily France and Germany, never go to war again. And the solution that was proposed touches on the second dimension I mentioned, the need to create economic interdependencies through large-scale projects between countries. The decision at the time, and it was highlighted by Robert Schuman, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs of France at the time, was to pull together the production of coal and steel and to create the European coal and steel community. And it's actually highlighted in the declaration. The reason was to make war unthinkable and materially unfeasible. Because you pull the production of coal, energy, which you need to go to war, you pull the production of steel, then you make it very difficult for countries to go to war. And it worked formidably well in their case, in the sense that from there started developing all the institutions you see today. It started with that, but eventually morphed into all types of economic cooperation that you see today, trade within trade matters, monetary union, and so on. So the economic interdependencies is where regional arrangements can really help us drive trust, but also force us through structural dependencies into promoting, because it's in everyone's interests, security. And then the third one really is security itself. Security or fragility considerations, if you wish, are borderless, and so are their intended security solutions, if you wish. So you must cooperate at regional level. At the level of Africa, we have a structure in place already, the African Peace and Security Architecture, APSA, with its different pillars, the Africa Peace Fund, the Panel of the Wise, the Continental Early Warning System to generate intelligence that countries can use to anticipate situations of fragility and conflict, the standby force. This mechanism is replicated at regional level. So you have the regional economic communities such as the Southern Africa Development Community, the East African Community, with similar mechanisms. So those regional arrangements, the ones you've mentioned, really help once they're functional, because there's still capacity gaps, I think we'll have a chance to discuss them later, that make them not function to the level that they should. But all said, the regional projects, regional investments, regional facilities, and regional arrangements as a whole, when properly utilized, can help us drive trust through enhanced policy dialogue, drive economic interdependencies through the financing of important assets, and in so doing, again, I mentioned it, rail, power, interconnectors. I gave the example of the European Union Coal and Steel Community. And then thirdly, by pushing countries to cooperate together, to tackle transnational security threats and so on. Thank you.
Very good points. Thank you so much. I think it couldn't have better been placed by explaining that economics can be the incentive for which we will not get into a war. So in essence, it's saying, let's increase the cost of wanting to go to war. And it's not the cost of the arms that you have to buy, but you have so much investment that you know you have too much to lose. And what you will want is to choose peace. I think I really like that nexus that you have presented. And you've given us a stark reality. We have this in the world. It's happening in the EU. It happened, and you're hardly hearing EU member states talking about wanting to go to war. What you're hearing is more member states wanting to even be part of the EU because they see the economic benefits as well as the security benefits. Ladies and gentlemen, I like an interactive panel, so I don't want to stop it from just my panel members. I like an interactive room. I'm going to open up the discussion for 2 questions. I see hands. But if you manage the questions to the minute, we'll get many more people to speak. Remember, the panel is about building trust for intra-Africa investments. What do we need to do in investment? And we've heard from our 2 distinguished panel members here that investment is not only for today's consumption, but it's invest today for future consumption and for the much longer term. And how do we define investment? And we've seen what are the disadvantages that we have for Africa not getting investment. We've heard about a clear example of how the economics of our economies can be the basis of guaranteeing our security. So let's focus the conversation around that before we move forward. I have one hand here. I'll take another. Do we have a mic in the room? If you trust your voice, you can try. Yes. Okay. Please say your name, your institution, and then go to the point as best as possible.
Of course. Good morning or afternoon. My name is Jimo Ayondele. I am a professor at New York University. Thank you again for your wonderful comments about the economic determinants for a stable Africa. One of the questions I wanted to pose to the panel is the fact that when we think about economic development and investment strategies, we usually aim it at the formal economic sector. But we know that the informal sector in Africa employs approximately 85% of our African workforce. So for me, and for the panel, especially coming from a decolonial, post-colonial scholarship, as well as the kind of work that I do, I'm wondering how we think about building trust for intra-African investment, taking into account the priority and prioritization of the informal sector, and not seeing the informal sector as a periphery, but as a core that needs to be put into our economic planning and how we think about transformation, especially given that we're at ISCA right now, we're thinking about reframing how we think about our economic determinants for a stable Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can see that was the only question, so I'm going to actually share it to both of you to respond to it, because I think you're helping us to bring this discussion in the context of Africa. So we talk about investment, and even the investment in Africa of 83 billion is not likely to be touching the informal sector. How can we attract that investment to really pull out the informal sector? And also when you talk about regional integration, when you talk about the infrastructure that is needed, we may not have really reflected on the informal sector. How can we make this reflective, knowing that even the youth that we're talking about and the women, they are actually majority in the informal sector? So let me give you a minute each to respond, but from the perspective of your question. Please, Professor Atif.
So the informal sector is very large in Africa, and that's typically true in developing countries. What should be part of a growth strategy is that it's typically costs of regulation, the wanting to sort of run away from the government is like one obvious reason you want to go towards the informal sector. So governments need to very actively encourage people to enter into the formal sector, because in the long run, there are huge advantages of joining the formal sector, because that is how everybody can fall into the tax net, for example, which is obviously important. Like when I was saying that, Africa needs to be more patient, I partly meant that in economic terms. And what patience in economic terms means is that you're able to spend a larger share of your overall output towards future investment, like building roads, colleges, universities that will really benefit you 10, 20 years from down the road. And in order to do that, you need to generate revenue from the economic activity. And that activity that needs to be in the formal sector for the government to be able to generate revenue from it. So it's partly a question of the people seeing a value in joining the formal sector, so the government needs to provide the services as a carrot to entice people to join the formal sector. You cannot do it by force, otherwise we would not have an informal sector to begin with. And so that requires that give and take, if you will, that the government needs to improve its services so people see an advantage to joining the formal sector. They can earn higher profits because they can hire labor more easily, expand more aggressively, and things of that nature. And in the long run, the informal sector needs to shrink. To say it differently, we don't know of rich countries which have a massive informal sector. There's a reason for that. And so I think we should encourage the economy to move more towards the formal sector over time.
Thank you so much. And I've actually liked the way you responded to it. By trying to get the informal sector in the formal sector, we're not doing them a favor. We're doing the economy a favor, because then governments need those to also get the taxes, much needed revenue that is required for investment. And I think we're often not presenting things in that context. We're thinking we're doing the informal sector a favor by trying for them to formalize, but there's a win-win, and I really like that approach that you've taken. I'll also want to hear from you, Jean-Guy, on your perspective on the same.
Thank you very much. I think when it comes to the informal sector, the fact that it's informal means there's usually very little data on what's really happening. Certain countries have actually, certain central banks have actually gone ahead and started tracking informal activity. And you have to remember that within the informal sector, there are plenty of things happening. You have your and I'll use an example here, in trade, you're a woman trader doing it as a basic survival mechanism, whom you want a regulatory environment that will protect. But you also have your criminals, you also have your criminal trading activity. So you start with the data to be able to disaggregate whom to fight and whom to help. So data is at the core of what we must do when it comes to the informal economy. We must understand it better. We must invest in profiling the categories of informal traders and then putting them in separate buckets. The criminals, we deal with them with the typical security architecture that we know exists. Usually they have the means to actually operate within the formal economy. It's a deliberate decision not to do so. But the other ones, the ones who are doing it out of a survival mechanism, the approach has to be much more gradual. And Rwanda has been particularly active in this space through the regional economic communities. I'll give the example of COMESA, where a system was put in place called the Simplified Trading Regime, STRs, where goods below a certain value were basically exempted from paying taxes but recorded in the system. So you get to know, you get to profile the traders, you encourage them eventually to use official routes, and then educate them on the benefits of joining the formal economy. So I definitely join what was said earlier. The objective is to formalize, but it starts with actually knowing who the actors are, and then designing instruments to gradually bring them into the formal economy. But it's, I agree to the point, it's very often an area that is probably not given sufficient attention. Usually when it is, it's primarily through the prism of informal trading, you know, and what's happening at the level of our borders, because it's more obvious, but it's also happening even at the level of the economy itself, even at the national level. And it would benefit from more investments in statistical capabilities that then inform policy designs and decisions made by government officials with the end goal of helping them join the formal economy while simultaneously tackling those who are in the informal space for reasons that are inappropriate.
Can I just add one thing on,
Please.
given our topic is trust as well, there's a very close connection between formalization of economic activity and the buildup of trust and reputation. Keep in mind that once an economic activity is formalized, John Africa, you start generating data on that economic activity. For example, you start to see which entrepreneurs are really profitable. You start to see which businessmen are actually paying back the loans that they received from a formal bank and things of that nature. When you start creating that data, you start creating a market automatically, where investors can now identify who are good and who are not that good. And that is the process. This is why I was trying to say that formalization is a natural way through which economy advances, and you need to expand that net. And you need to discourage informality, because it's also a way, the more informal things are, the shadier they tend to be and all of that. But the other thing is, if things become very informal, if you are not in the right network, you can't access those opportunities, which might be along, you know, tribal affiliation, language affiliation, country affiliations, and so on. So when we talk about going pan-Africa, when we talk about intra-Africa trade and so on, you can obviously imagine informality is not going to cut it. So I think encouraging formalization of economic activity and facilitating it by building the right administrative structures, building the data behind it, that will really encourage the buildup of reputation that you ultimately need for trade and investment.
Thank you. I think that question, absolutely, we're going to move to the second question and then we'll take questions again, brought us closer to understanding, and I like the angle you've given it as well, that there's a trust element. If I'm in the informal sector, I'll be interested to want to be formalized if I'm guaranteed I'll get those services. So I have to trust the system that they're not formalizing me because they only want to take taxes from me, but I can get access to the several services that I would like to take. So indeed, and again, the informal sector is large on the continent, we know this. We cannot be talking about investment and building trust without referring to them or even attracting investment that allows us to formalize. But again, we know that most of these investments and the discussion around regional economic integration is really around fostering trade as well. It is not only for us to do the economic activities within our borders, but how do we do so across borders and across the continent as a whole? So I'm going to move to the second set of questions that is really going to bring us to, even though we are referring to building trust and investment, but it's investment for what? So let's take trade as one of them. So Professor Atim, I want you to tell me a little bit about intra-Africa trade and investment. Why has within an intra-Africa trade and investment remained low? What policy choices, such as taxation, regulation, fiscal and monetary level, need to be made to enhance intra-Africa trade and investment? And I'll quickly ask Jean-Guy's question, which is also related, so that both of you can just respond at one. From your perspective, Jean-Guy, I want you to describe transformative potential of intra-Africa investment for sustainable development, job creation, and inclusive growth. What are the kinds of things we are likely to see if we really get to improve intra-Africa trade? So on one hand, Professor Atif will tell us, why is it that we haven't seen much of intra-Africa trade and investment? You tell us, what can we dream of should this happen? And what can we dream of with regards to job creation, inclusive growth, as well as sustainable development? Thank you.
I think first of all, it's important to acknowledge that Africa has moved in the right direction in many ways. So for example, if you take the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, that is a result of this realization or recognition at the highest levels that there needs to be more free trade and we need to break down the barriers to trade, both tariff and non-tariff. So I think things are moving in that sense in the right direction in terms of people recognizing the importance of trade. When we look at trade from an empirical academic angle, the biggest predictor of trade between two countries is what is referred to as the gravity model, which is the closer the two countries are geographically, then they trade according to or inversely to the distance between them and proportional to the size of the two economies. When you apply that gravity model that statistically, as I said, explains trade the most internationally, there's a bit of a puzzle when it comes to Africa, which is that what you predict according to the gravity model should be the level of trade. You don't see it inside Africa. Okay, so that's a very sort of empirically descriptive way of saying, look, Africa is not trading as much as the rest of the world is trading amongst itself. So there's clearly a problem in that statistical sense. To put some numbers to it, Africa should be trading at least 35 to 50% more than the level of trade we see today, even conditioning on the income per capita of the various countries inside Africa. So there's clearly a deficiency there. In terms of identifying what can be done or should be done going forward, there's some of the obvious one, reducing transactions and so on. But there's some practical issues of harmonization of products as they move across borders, for example. There are other practical issues, like one particular example I'll give is on the monetary side, there are two main unions. And in my view, those are hindrances to trade within Africa because from a technical perspective, those currency unions actually do not make much sense because those currencies are tied to Europe. And I will not get into the macroeconomics of it, but there is no justification that one can reasonably give for African countries to tie their currency to what is happening in Europe. The economic imperatives are very, Africa is a resource-rich environment that has its own commodity price shocks. Again, it makes no, so when we talk about facilitating trade, we also need to reduce volatility, macroeconomic volatility in the respective African countries. And one important tool for reducing macroeconomic volatility from a macro policy perspective is to have monetary sovereignty, which means you have your own currency that you have control over. When you're in a currency union that is tied to Europe, you're fundamentally giving up that sovereignty. So as has been the theme of this conference as well, which is to gain sovereignty in all other dimensions, to bring it back to Africa, I think this is, there are many other ways, but this is one very important issue of sovereignty that I will raise on the economic side, that Africa needs to have complete monetary sovereignty. You need to then develop institutions. This, by the way, is another form of trust, which is building central banks, building monetary policy institutions that people in general can trust in. For example, do we trust in the respective central banks that they will be able to maintain or anchor inflation? It's a very important point that people learned in, over the years, that the Federal Reserve in the US or central banks in general, they are of supreme importance in managing and anchoring expectations when it comes to inflation. And you need to give them that independence, that room of maneuverability, so they can take certain actions like interest rates and so on to manage inflation and outlook for inflation. As we know, inflation is a big issue in many of the African countries. So that is a very important institutional improvement that many countries in Africa need to make, so they can anchor inflation expectations that will build trust in the system and bring in more investment. An investor is unlikely to make major investments if they don't know 20 years from now whether the rate of inflation is going to be 2% or 20% or 200%. A very high rate of inflation very quickly erodes whatever investments you may have made. And when you're making investments for the long term, remember I started off by saying true investment is put in capital today and it gives you the fruit 5, 10, 20 years from today. You can only do that if you have stability in the system, that you can trust the credibility of macro policy in the long run. So it's a very important, I'll just end on this note, that in terms of building the environment for long-term investment, you need to build trust at the institutional level. And that's where institutions such as central banks are very important. But at the same time, governments and fiscal authorities also need to develop that trust that they will maintain discipline on the fiscal side, because that's the other side of the coin, that governments do not overspend their resources.
Thank you very much. I'll just go straight to you, please.
Yeah, surely. So on driving intra-African investments, here it's really a question of creating spaces where capital flows freely. And it sounds simple, but it's actually quite complicated to arrive at when you're talking of multiple countries with asymmetries in administrative capabilities, different roles, and so on. But at the very basic, you actually would like to create an investment space that is harmonized from a regulatory and institutional perspective. That's why you find that most regional economic communities adopt investment codes, attempt to arrive at the creation of capital markets where flows function more or less, where capital flows freely, where there are investments in harmonizing costs across in terms of infrastructure, so that you spread out the economic opportunities. So, but the challenge that we usually face, and which could be turned into the opportunities, is the question of governance. The pace is uneven in terms of the effort to establish those spaces that would allow intra-African investments to flow. And I think it was mentioned by His Excellency during the first day, the issue of governance. I would add to it the challenge of administrative capabilities. And here is just the capacity of a state to administer a country and to solve problems. Usually, if you take the example of when you take development, you could think of it as a succession of problems that you attempt to solve. You know, it applies also for intra-African investment. You have no schools, so you need to plan for it. You need to allocate resources across institutions. You need to regulate for it, meaning strategies and instruments that you adopt. You need to coordinate across institutions, and you need to execute. Then you generate feedback loops, and you start again. And the problem is compounded because at the regional level, you try to do the same thing. Countries come together, again, identify a problem, plan for it, regulate for it in terms of strategies and laws, coordinate across countries, execute, generate feedback loops, and try again. And where the challenge, and it's not just for Africa, it's the world over, what you usually find is planning, regulating, passing the policies, the laws, is much easier than coordinating and executing. Take trade, for example. Let's say country X is attempting to increase flows of trade. In agriculture, you would need to get the Ministry of Agriculture involved. The Ministry of Trade would need to be involved. The Customs Authority would need to be involved, and so on. So the challenge in setting up the kind of spaces that would allow for intra-African investments to flow are inherently tied to our administrative capabilities at the level of nations and the need to strengthen them so that when we pass and we regulate at regional level, we actually execute. We have most instruments are passed, but you'll find that very few of them are actually executed on the ground. And therein lies the challenge, because at regional level, you're entirely reliant on the political will of nations to execute and their administrative capabilities. So when one of those are missing, then you end up with huge asymmetries in execution and uneven spaces. So I would argue that going back to the basics, essentially, it's a bit counterintuitive in the sense that if you want to drive intra-African investments, you also have to implement the policies that you've approved at regional level, execute them, and it starts with investing more into our governance systems and strengthening our administrative capabilities. I think I will also add, it was mentioned earlier, the element of proximity. Much of the intra-African investment is going to happen at regional level. You'll see, for example, that within the SADC region, close to 60% is driven by South Africa. You know, you'll find that in the East African region, it's usually the larger economy that dominates Kenya with large outbound investments. So the future in terms of intra-African investment will have a lot to do with strengthening the existing geographic and economic ties at regional level. And when we've reached sufficient capabilities at regional level, then scaling up at continental level. It's actually the strategy of the AU of using the regions as launchpad for the wider continental integration, you know. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're enjoying the conversation as much as I am. I'm coming now next to you, putting into perspective the importance for trade as we discuss building trust. And I'm glad that Professor Atif reminded us of the Africa Continental Free Trade, which is a very good step in the right direction. Albeit its challenges, such as the monetary union, I know that AfCFTA Bank was putting a system in place to allow ease of payment. That is by no means a solution to the monetary union. It's only doing a bandage to something that requires a more fundamental change, etc. So if anyone is in the audience who has more information, updates on progress on monetary union on the continent, that would be very helpful for the conversation. I'm glad that Jean-Guy, you point on the governance elements, the integrated nature of policy. When we talk about trade, the number of institutions in one country, let alone you're talking about several countries, that is required. But I like also to add that the World Investment Report mentions that Nigeria and South Africa remain attractive destinations for investment, but that Botswana and Rwanda are growing interests. And Botswana and Rwanda are not by many means big economies, but they're really putting things in place that are going to be attracting investment. So it's not about size. It's really about the quality of your institutions, the policies, your legal framework, and all of those mechanisms to attract investment. So let me bring it back to you. Building trust for intra-Africa investment. Questions, comments, if you can keep it to under a minute, we can have several hands. I have your hand and your hands. I'm glad. 3. The mic here in front, please. I think it's people who are sitting in front who are likely to be asking questions. So if you want to ask the question, please come to the front.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be in the presence of these esteemed gentlemen. Read about them, now I've seen them. This is an observation, and I want you, the guys in academia, to go and have a look at it, simply because of this informal sector you guys are talking about is what we all grew up with and continue to see in a big way. But in Uganda, and I think even Kenya too, the mobile money dragged so many people into the semi-formal, into the formal sector to a certain extent, to a large extent actually, because I don't think less than 85% of our population they are all in mobile money now. So I would like you to have a deeper look at it, you academicians, how much the informal sector got a bit formalized, got into some taxation through the mobile, the telcos, and yet still wanted to stay informal. That is one. My second observation is that the interest rate trade is that the very interesting phenomenon in Uganda where we have built infrastructure. In the last 5 years, we built we didn't build a road, but we repaired Amaram Road from Pondwe in Kasese all the way to Beni and Butembo. And without much, without any regularization or supervision, the people all went into trade. Even some of those rebel activities kind of ended. The thugs that were in that area, everyone now went into trading. And that's another area I would like you guys to have a look at. What a road can do in terms of dragging the informal people into. And also as the example of Gulu Nimule, Juba Road, the growth of these towns in the north of Uganda, just because of tamakadamizing that road in 2010, the effect it had on the economy. Those are two intra-state growth of trade simply because of infrastructure. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, please. The gentleman next time. Let's keep it short, please.
Okay, thank you. Vice Admiral Yakubu, immediate past Chief of the Navy of Ghana. I'm also now the chairman of the Gulf of Guinea Maritime Institute. It is an institute that tries to build capacity among young people, particularly to look at the blue economy, which we are not talking about. There's a lot of potential there. Listening to the very distinguished panelists, a lot has come up, and I want to zero in on two issues. The first is on the issue of integration. And Professor Mr. Jenge has mentioned it, that it might be difficult for proximities to start with the whole continent as a whole. Maybe we should look at the regional blocks. I think, I don't even know why at this time we are talking about 54 countries in Africa. And these countries were created by a group of Europeans sitting around a dining table with the map on the table and then just divided it among themselves. And we are guarding these borders so much. I think we should look more at loosening these borders in order to allow more integration. And in ECOWAS, where I come from, a lot of our regional economic community, ECOWAS, a lot happened in terms of integration, but we are now suffering some setbacks. And it also comes to the issue of trust. I remember Nigeria had some, was it a tariff regime or even a trade restriction for rice, because they knew they wanted to boost domestic production and actually banned or restricted the importation of rice. Their neighbor Benin started importing so much rice, and it was observed that they had imported about 10 times the amount of rice they consume within their borders, because ECOWAS has a free customs regime, free movement of goods and people across borders. So Nigeria had to close their borders to this movement of goods within the region. So this is one of the issues of trust. Right now, there's a lot of disruption in our system. A lot of disruption in the world, where we are moving from multilateralism to a lot of bilateral arrangements. We know all the tariff regimes that have come, and every country or regional bloc is negotiating their own tariff regimes and trade regimes, trades. How can 54 tiny countries, calling themselves countries, sit with the US to negotiate a trade agreement? I think we need to look at integration more seriously.
Thank you very much. The next speaker, I'm going to be a lot more stricter on time, please, is here, because we're standing between you and your lunch.
Thank you, thank you. Mine will be a quick and painless one. Given the fragmented regulatory frameworks, and to some extent, the diverse political architecture within the African member states, what are the practical measures that you may suggest which might propagate trust between the member states in terms of fueling this trade, especially where you see that some may not risk, engaging in such business arrangements? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we got 4 questions, and I'm going to just distribute them 2 each. I feel like Jean-Guy can respond to the question on mobile money, the formalized, and I can see you smiling. You like that question a lot. And I'll ask Professor Atif to tell us a bit more on how infrastructure can be a basis of formalizing, and maybe with an emphasis on even digital infrastructure in this case. And I'll come back to you, Jean-Guy. Your second question would be on integration. We have regional economic communities, smaller ones, but you have the AU. Why are we not trying to focus on the sub-regional RECs instead of going to the communities and loosening borders? And the last question around fragmented regulatory framework, I'll ask Professor Atif to talk about them. So it's 2 questions, 8. Please go ahead, Professor Atif.
Thank you. Let me talk about how infrastructure or public investment in general can be used as an excuse for better integration. One example to give is if you look at Europe and you look at Airbus, right? That would be an example of Airbus is not, it's a European project, it's not a single country's project. And I think there are many examples like that you can think of where African countries, and I think this is actually very important from an industrial policy perspective, a group of African countries, doesn't have to be all 54 all the time, can come together and decide to co-invest on a particular area, could be infrastructure, could be an example like we'll start manufacturing aircrafts or we'll start data center on the IT side. And they subdivide the production networks that we will specialize in this area that is an input into the final product that we are going to be making. Or we will coordinate on electricity grid or high-speed railway, and we will again specialize in, one can specialize in batteries or energy, another one can specialize on the engineering or the engines and so on. The broader point is, this is partly what I was trying to say in the beginning, that you need to develop those capacities domestically. Do not go to a Western country or any other country and say, give us the whole project and we will borrow from you and then just deliver the whole project to us. Even if they do that, you haven't developed any of the expertise. Use the same as an excuse to integrate and develop those capacities. You have to obviously gradually do it. So you need to know what your current capacities are and what are the first right set of projects to start with. But this is the approach, and I would really encourage the African policymakers to study the Chinese growth experience very carefully. Because this is how, in many ways, they graduated up. They say the Chinese proverb, you cross the river by touching the stone, the next step to take. But they developed these domestic capacities over time, starting with low-scale manufacturing, and then graduating up, and now they are, a force to be reckoned with. I think in the same way, the African countries need to work on their respective industrial policies. The one difference is that China was a more centralized place, so they could, decision-making could be done in a more centralized manner. Africa, for obvious reasons, has to do it with coming together the various sovereign countries. But as I said, it doesn't have to be 54 countries all the time. It can be done on a regional basis, and at the same time having, you then keep leveraging those capacities that you develop to do things at the more continental level. But these partnerships, cross-border partnerships, are essential to both integrate and B, to develop that level of trust and interdependency that we started talking about. That once you develop that, then obviously you're not going to go to war, for example, because the aircraft that you're building, where will you get the engine from if you go to war with the country that's delivering you engines? So these are the, we need to build those excuses for mutual interdependency, and there is a science behind it in this industrial policy genre that's becoming more popular anyways. So I think we need to proactively think along those lines and come up with ideas, explicit ideas.
Thank you very much. And I think in the short form of it, it means let's identify regional value chains, wherein everybody has a specialized role across that value chain, and we are all ending up to a particular product. We can all have several value chains, but let's identify sub-regionals. A number of countries say we want to construct railway. Who has the ore in their country? You mine that ore. Who processes them into steel? Who puts them together? Who builds the train across different countries? So let's identify regional value chains, and they create a base in which we build trust. Now to you, Jean-Guy, mobile money and formalization, as well as integration. Do we go REX, or do we remain AfCFTA and AU level?
Thank you very much. On informal activity actually happening on mobile money, this is a very interesting case study. And I think the informal economy itself shifted to the digital world because it was so convenient. Think of the person sending money to their parents in the village. In the past, probably had to give it to someone that would hop on a bus and go, or even trading. So it's happening, but it's not being taxed the way it should be. Because, I mean, even now, the activity itself is taxed at the level of the telecom. So even if informal activity is happening through the use of mobile money, it's probably not captured in the way we were discussing earlier, in a formal way and so on. So, but it's a starting point in the sense that it generates the data that we need to start making the right decisions. You know, so, and it's definitely better than if the commercial activity was happening physically. So I think mobile money provides a formidable opportunity to start if we can access the data, if we can work with the telecom and banking operators to start to map out flows that are commercial in nature and ways to utilizing, again, the whole aspect I highlighted earlier of investing in statistical capabilities and data to arrive at a better profiling of the economy, of the informal economy itself, so that we can make better decisions. So I think the digital part will play a huge role. On the debate about the regional integration, I don't think we should oppose the continental approach to the regional one, but there are also facts, you know, that just speak for themselves. For example, the extent of countries' contributions to the regional economic communities. That will tell you a lot about where they see their priorities. And it goes back to what was said earlier, that geography very much ties you structurally into where your immediate opportunities for industrialization will be. It's much easier for us to trade. It doesn't mean it won't happen, but it's much easier for us to trade with Uganda, with Tanzania, with Kenya than it is to do so with Ivory Coast. Doesn't mean that it won't happen, but in the immediate, the short opportunities, the immediate opportunities are definitely closer to the region, and that's applicable the continent around. I think it's also important to highlight that Africa is huge. The actual landmass, something to the tune of 30 million square kilometers. And the European Union, the 27 countries, is about 5 million square kilometers. So the distances and the costs associated when you're trying to cross make it very difficult for you to adopt a model where your short-term opportunities will be across the continent. So I think structurally, you will find, and it's even enshrined in the AU's approach of using the REX as building blocks. And I think we need to highlight that we come from a long way. There was a time where we had close to 20 REX. In fact, there was an image that was floating around all the time of the spaghetti bowl of REX in Africa. And we went through a rationalization process. Today, the AU only recognizes 8 regional economic communities. you know? So that process of rationalizing RECs helped us go a long way in better allocating resources and so on. But still, to this day, you'll find that the building blocks for the creation of the African economic community are still the regional economic communities. Now, the beauty of the AfCFTA is that most of the RECs have established free trade areas. Some even have currency unions, others customs union, and so on. So trade is highly liberalized across most RECs. What was missing was the intra-REC trading, and that's where the AfCFTA comes in. The AfCFTA also has a series of flagship programs that ties into the very nice example he highlighted. There were certain sectors that were identified as priority. Automotive was one, with the idea that production could be, we could create production networks with different countries specializing on different parts. And that needs to be continued. It requires consistent effort at the policy level. It requires you to bring along the private sector and to create, basically implement rules and policy over a very long period of time. I'll close with one comment. You mentioned earlier the issue of FDI and what we had done to perform quite well in the area of foreign direct investment, Rwanda, despite us being market-wise much smaller than most economies. And it's entirely about the business environment. Rwanda has invested a lot in creating a business environment that is predictable and in turning the business environment into our unique selling proposition. And over time, and we've been also very ingenious about it. So you'll see that our positioning is come, set up your business in Rwanda and expand from here into the region, which has a much, so the thinking around it was the business environment and so on. So it's just to touch your point that there are many ways that you can go about addressing structural challenges. Creating a predictable business environment is one, an environment where the investor knows what to expect, where there is sanctity of contracts and so on, and that has been the approach that we've taken. What we did, this is my last point, was to bring together close to 24 agencies under the one-stop center in the Rwanda Development Board, parts of 24 agencies that are investor-facing. You'll very often find that investors have challenges with land, challenges with electricity, challenges with water, challenges with their agreements not being implemented, incentives provided in their agreements not being implemented. So we've turned RDB into a focal point, a one-stop shop for the investors' queries and challenges to be addressed. And over time, it's resulted in what you're seeing today. Yes.
Thank you so much, Jangi. You've given your last word already. I'll come to you for a last word, Professor Atif, because I was going to ask, we've discussed investment, and of course we agree that just before the World Bank discontinued the publication of the Doing Business Index, Rwanda was doing very well, one of the countries on the continent that was always ranking very well in the Doing Business Index, so we see that. But this afternoon, we've discussed investment, what it means in economic sense, trade. We've talked about the policy integration that is needed, governance, the informal sector and its importance for building trust and intra-Africa trade, the AfCFTA constraints around monetary union, etc. I think it's been a rich conversation. I'm going to ask Professor Atif if there's any other area, but as you reflect on that, I have a few points that I just want to make. Are there any other areas the continent should be focusing on to achieve trust for intra-investment that we haven't discussed? I know Jean-Guy has already given us the need for the country to be very prepared and to put into systems to give investor confidence is very important. So I'll come to you. But as I say that, I have to use the opportunity that I work for UNDP, and we have an initiative referred to as the Timbuktu Initiative. I started by giving you information on the youth bulge in Africa and the need for us to pay attention on investment in youth. UNDP is running an initiative called Timbuktu Initiative that is placing youth at the center of innovation, entrepreneurship, and capital formation. Ambitious projects that is developing 10 thematic hubs across Africa. Here in Rwanda, we have the Health Tech Hub. Students who can, or pupils, young people across the continent who can innovate anything around health are connected to the Health Tech Hub here, and they're provided with some seed capital for them to expand their ideas and take them to markets. We have a Timbuktu Foundation that then goes out there to seek the capital for them to expand their trade across the continent. In Nigeria, we have the FinTech Hub. In Kenya, we have the Green Tech Hub, which focuses on climate change, etc. The ultimate aim is for us to have 100,000 young innovators in the next 10 years as UNDP across Africa. And I just felt it was important to lay this emphasis because we don't want to leave this room as if nothing is happening around building trust and investment. A lot is happening, and we have to leave the room with that information. Professor Atif, let me allow you to please give your last words on what else do we need to do.
Thank you. Let me just close talking not about economics, but maybe a bit more philosophical, a bit more spiritual, if you wish, on the question of trust or integration. You see, ultimately, integration is about sharing sovereignty. It's a very serious issue. It's not easy, actually. Even, you're talking about these industrial policy and so on. Even if you do all of that, and we can learn from the European experiment on that, actually. Even as we speak, there are massive political forces inside Europe. They're not happy. They want to break it up because they feel like the Brussels or the European Union is breathing on their on their individual sovereignty. I just want to point out to me what that says is that ultimately it's about the people feeling connected to each other. That's the spiritual or philosophical point I want to make here, which is extremely important, that the people of Africa feel connected as one people. And no level of trade or regulation is going to do that until and unless the people actually meet and see each other frequently. And so one practical suggestion I would personally want to put forward is that Africa must develop more and more institutional excuses for people, especially young people, to meet each other across borders. For example, I would actually promote the setting up of an African Union-wide system of universities that encourages young people to go to other African countries to get educated when they go to colleges and so on and so forth. That will naturally allow people to mix. And by the way, there is a long-standing literature that has shown that these social networks that you then develop, they are critical to boosting trade. People will get married across borders and so on and so forth. And it's through these networks that you can really form very durable partnerships going forward. So I'll just end on that message that it's very important to keep the people in mind. And when people are united, then it doesn't matter whether you have those artificial borders that the Europeans put in place or not. Thank you very much.
What a beautiful note to end off and to reassure you that it's already happening on the continent. Maybe we need to scale it some more. We have the Africa Leadership University here in Rwanda. There's the Carnegie Mellon University. When I visited it, it had students from across Africa. There's the Africa Governance Institute that is also established here in Rwanda. But maybe we need a lot more of us to know it. As we conclude, I really want to take the opportunity for us to give a round of applause, but to end on this note. We must remember that the opposite of development is not just poverty. It is disempowerment. And Africa cannot afford to disempower its greatest assets, its youth. Whether we talk about them in boardrooms, in classrooms, or in startup labs, the inclusion of young Africans in our economic transformation journey is not a charity. It is a necessity. Initiatives like Timbuktu I spoke about are not optional. They are our collective responsibility. Ladies and gentlemen, help me thank the distinguished panelists as well as all of you for your participation in this forum. Thank you very much.